Hey, what's up? I'm going to be reading this article from Cato Unbound, which is catounbound.org. I think I'll leave a link below to it. It's called Does Classical Liberalism Need Intersectionality Theory? And this is by Phillip W. Magness, and just getting into that now. Before I get into the reading, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Phil Magness. For those of you who are familiar with my content, my channel, wherever you're listening to this on, welcome back. You might have seen the series that I have on the 1619 Project, where I'm having a conversation with my friend Steven, and we're just talking about the book, The 1619 Project, A Critique, where Phil Magness critiques the New York Times 69 Project. That's a reimagining of the history of the United States of America. For those of you who are new, welcome. Like, share, subscribe, hit notification bells where possible. And this is the kind of content that's on my channel. With this one, it's going to be more of a straight reading of an article. I'm switching towards having more conversations where I talk to people about things that they have experienced or just things we share in common. And then I have other ones where I just talk about random things here and there. With this one, I'm not going to be actually giving too much commentary. I'll probably give commentary at the end of the reading, but I just want to go with as straight of a reading as possible. Okay, so Phillip Magness is from Cato Unbound. Phillip Magness is a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. He's the author of numerous works on economic history, taxation, economic inequality, the history of slavery, and education policy in the United States. He's the author of or editor of several books, including The Rules of the Game, How Government Works and Why It Sometimes Doesn't, co-authored with Paul Weisberg in 2011, Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education. And with that one, me and my friend Steven are going to go, that's going to be the next series we'll go through. Right now, we're going through a series about critical theory, a series of conversations. I'm still posting as this goes. And in the latest one we recorded, which is the second to last bit of that conversation series, he mentioned this. I was like, okay, I'm going to read it because he had posted it before, and then I'm going to post it, and this will be posted before that series is over and before we've started reading or started having the conversation about the Cracks in the Ivory Tower series. That one is co-authored by Jason Brennan in 2019, and most recently, the 1619 Project, A Critique of 2020, which I mentioned before, we've already had a discussion about. So Phillip Magness holds a PhD in public policy from George Mason University and a Bachelor's of Arts in political science from the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. And he has an essay here also called May 2020, Intersectionality and Classical Liberalism. Now, I have a separate video talking about this. Part of, I think, why Steven suggested I read this is because of our history with appreciating Phillip Magness's thoughts, or Phillip Magness's thoughts. And also, we had a series in this critical theory series where we talked about intersectionality. It was in the video where I posted, I think the opening was critical race theory and then goes into intersectionality. And this is an expansion on that and how it actually is practically involved in the left. And I think it's liberalism. Now, it depends on how you define liberalism and things like that. That's going to be, I think, kind of interesting here. Now, I'm going to get into the reading but a little bit about this. It seems to be a project together, at least the cover of the article here has something saying intersectionality and classical liberalism, then Jacob T. Levy, Fabio Rojas, Phillip Magness, and Melissa Harris Perry. And I tried to check. I was like, Melissa Harris Perry, is that the one lady or woman who used to be on MSNBC? And yes, it turns out she used to be a professor, or she is currently a professor at Wake Forest University. And she said some things about racism. I see here there was something she said years ago. I forget what it was. It was as a bit on MSNBC or something, and it was something about racism or sexism. But she's something here I've just seen in the recent story. It says, since when has racism and sexism disqualified somebody from being the American president? And I think that's true. There's a lot of racist and sexist people all over the place, all over the world. They're still in positions of power. I don't think that has ever actually disqualified an American president. So I think the fact that we're talking about some of these things currently is a positive thing. Now, talking about it versus saying this is the way things are and we need to actually do something about it, or this is a major issue, I think that's when you come into it. But the fact that we talk about some of these things is something I'm not against. And that is something I'd like to talk about here with critical theory, with intersectionality, with some of these things. The ideas, talking about things, the thoughts. I may agree with some of them. I might find some worth in them. But the practical nature, the applications of these thoughts are where I normally take issue with. Okay, so just getting into the article now, I will just try to do a straight read as I mentioned, and then give some commentary at the end. So getting into it now. Does classical liberalism need intersectionality theory? Although it remains a point of widely varying emphasis across the past 2 centuries, a clear strain of anti-discriminatory thought undergirds what may be broadly summarized as a classical liberal philosophical tradition. Its applications extend to race, gender, and religion, and generally aim to center the epistemic humility of toleration within its consideration of individuality. This approach was succinctly summarized by 18th century liberal Whig forebearer Charles James Fox, who noted, quote, "Persecution always says, 'I know the consequences of your opinion better than you know them yourselves.' But language of toleration was always amicable, liberal, and just. It confessed its doubts and acknowledged its ignorance." End quote. Such an approach prioritized assessment, quote, "from actions and not from opinions," end quote, as distinct from prejudicial forms of reasoning that render value judgments out of fixed prior assumptions about an individual's associations, characteristics, or identity. Although the specific occasion of Fox's comment was a plea for religious toleration, its principle forms the basis of a broader recognition of the interrelation between discriminatory injustices and state institutions. We find a similar recognition in Adam Smith's indictment of the colonial slave owner who employed political leverage to entrench his institution with a complex system of subsidies and discriminatory laws. Indeed, Fox himself would lead a two-decade parliamentary campaign to dismantle this system's sustaining lifeblood from the transatlantic slave trade. A common current flows through Richard Cobden's intentional pairing of abolitionism and free market theory under the banner of Exeter Hall liberalism. Cobden's economic program was branded the dismal science by its adversaries, specifically from the threat it posed to entrenched racial and class hierarchies. So pronounced were these sentiments that the pro-slavery radical George Fitzhugh assailed the liberal maxim of laissez-faire in 1851 for making war with all kinds of slavery on account of depriving the state of its tools of hierarchical enforcement, and make war upon slavery they did. The same liberal tradition provided one of the few consistent voices against progressive eugenic planning in the early 20th century. Ludwig von Mises chastised Keynes in 1927 for unwittingly opening the political doors to mass atrocity by presumptively elevating this new science to a function of state policy. Friedrich A. Hayek's withering dissection of the racial totalitarian Nazi regime a decade later explored a devastation wrought by the same intolerant lines of reasoning. We find lesser-known manifestations of the liberal anti-discriminatory current in newspaper editor R.C. Hoyles, who took a nearly solitary stance against Franklin Roosevelt's Japanese internment program, and who campaigned against the segregation of Mexican American students in 1947 as part of an important case precedent for Brown versus Board. In the post-war era, classical liberalism provided a basis for scholarly investigation of the symbiosis between state power and racial discrimination, as seen in W.H. Hutt's dissection of the South African apartheid regime, Gary Becker's empirics-driven formalization of an economic theory of discrimination, the public choice subfield's investigations of discriminatory political institutions, and liberal constitutional theorizing around a non-discriminatory generality norm. I suspect that Jacob Levy would join me in lamenting how the principles of toleration and non-discrimination have languished from underdeveloped attention in some libertarian circles. Yet I also question a presumptive claim from his lead essay that we astonishingly manage to forget that in the United States, racism has been a source of statism, that state power has been expanded to enhance and entrench racial domination. Clearly, as the foregoing examples illustrate, Cognizance of this very problem runs deep within the last 2.5 centuries of the liberal intellectual tradition. Levi nonetheless proceeds from the belief that a gap exists in classical liberal theory's treatment of racial and other forms of discrimination. His argument, then, holds that this gap may be filled with what he describes as the essential insights of intersectionality analysis. First posited by legal theorist Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s, intersectionality has become an immensely fashionable epistemic framework in academic discussions of race, gender, and other social identities, particularly as they interact under discriminatory or oppressive circumstances. Yet it also has come under fire for how its own ideological baggage, and particularly its association with a number of far-left activist causes, including overt hostility to free market economic theory. While Levy largely discounts these charges as a caricature of a mode of analysis he finds useful, they nonetheless warrant consideration when assessing the relationship between intersectionality theory and classical liberalism. That brings us to the question of what intersectionality theory has to offer to the same classical liberal tradition. If it is a largely innocuous device for understanding how racism and misogyny work and interact at a social and cultural level, as Levi contends, such considerations might be expected to augment the aforementioned anti-discriminatory current to liberal thought. But if, as its critics often charge, intersectionality theory serves primarily to import anti-capitalist, Marxist, and other far-left ideological priors into social scientific analysis, an obvious tension emerges between it and the liberal tradition. Indeed, the tension would be tantamount to a complete inversion of the conscious historical links between anti-discriminatory toleration and free market theory, dating back to Fox, Smith, Cobden, and Hayek. In attempting to answer these questions, I will note that it is not my intention to dispute whether the problems of discrimination may be interpreted through the framework of intersectional theory. Obviously, they can, and they are with great frequency in the academic literature on race and gender. Rather, we must ask whether an intersectional framework is a necessary tool for understanding the interacting effects of discriminatory experiences, to the extent that any tradition that attempts to grapple with these problems will come up short in the absence of that framework. And we must also consider both the robustness of intersectionality as an analytical tool and its vulnerability to epistemic or ideological baggage, as the concept's critics allege. Between two intersectionalities. Before turning directly to these issues, it's helpful to develop a functional definition of the concept of intersectionality. In doing so, allow me to suggest that there are actually two forms of the concept at play in the associated academic literature, including Crenshaw's original presentation. For convenience of this discussion, I will designate them as its elementary and compound forms. Elementary intersectionality offers a relatively straightforward observation. Drawing on the analogy of a traffic intersection in which cars flow from multiple directions and, should a collision occur, the quickly compounding effects that follow. Crenshaw presents the term as a mental model for understanding social interactions as well. Elementary intersectionality thus asserts that interactions traversing multiple social identities, which are race, class, gender, religion, sexuality, politics, and so forth, will produce distinct modes of experience that are different from the experience of any one of those identities when viewed in isolation. This in turn shapes how a social encounter is received by its participants, especially in face of discrimination against one or more components' social identity. The intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, she explains. As a result, any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which a member of multiple identity groups, Crenshaw uses the example of African American female, experiences discriminatory subordination. Crenshaw's claim here is fairly innocuous in its elementary form and rings true as a simple descriptive observation. This elementary usage is also consistent with what Levi refers to as intersectionality rightly understood in his essay, but that truth is also banally so, even to the point one might legitimately wonder whether its basic insight is significant enough to warrant so much ink, or whether such interactive complexities were not already a matter of human intuitions long before the specific coining of that term. Intersectionality's academic fashionability likely derives from the path dependency of the scholarly literature it emerged from, as Levi often acknowledges. Crenshaw first presented the concept as a corrective to the shortcomings of earlier feminist theory, which in her critique had placed the white middle class female experience at the center of feminism to the neglect of other identities, including overlapping experiences that diverged from this archetype. This critique may be entirely appropriate given where mainstream feminist theory stood at the time of Crenshaw's original article. Its extension to other modes of analysis becomes another matter, particularly given that the intersectionality literature has long since expanded its reach beyond the mid-century feminist genre typified by Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Here we also begin to encounter the concept's limitations. Outside of the normative philosophical universe of critical theory, social scientists have long used a fairly similar conceptual tool to place the study of compound social interactions of almost all types on a firmer empirical basis. Levi's lead essay openly acknowledges this similarity by way of comparison, but multivariate regression analysis aims not only to quantify the effects of multiple variables upon an observed social phenomenon, it also provides a testable approach for discerning correlations between those terms. Teasing out the compounding effects of multiple interacting variables is arguably the great challenge of this line of empirical analysis, and it carries with it a benefit that casual intersectionality theorizing often lacks: scientific falsibility. Of course, a related challenge is the limitations of empirical approaches in assessing variables that are not easily quantified, which is where Levy proposes the parallel value of qualitative intersectional analysis. But difficulty to measure does not mean impossible to measure. And in this elementary form, even a charitable interpretation of intersectionality theory begins to look a lot like armchair multivariate regression, wherein weak or missing data are made up for by interjecting unfalsifiable normative speculation about how race, gender, and other identity categories interact with each other. Let us turn then to the second form of intersectionality theory, though, which I again refer to here as compound intersectionality for purposes of convenience. Whereas I'm somewhat inclined to agree with Levi that conservatives have caricatured the elementary intersectionality claim as delineated above, their charges against the concept gain greater salience when redirected to the compound form. So what do I mean by compound intersectionality? Here I refer to the scholarly literature, including subsequent contributions by Crenshaw, that takes the relatively uncontroversial, if also mundane elementary iteration of the concept, then extends it to a universal mode of socio-political analysis and, with it, socio-political activism. Examples of compound intersectionality theory abound in the scholarly literature, often taking the form of sweeping denunciations of disliked beliefs, concepts, and social institutions. In most forms, it functions as a normative identification strategy to imbue the characteristics of racism, sexism, white supremacy, and other bigotries onto the oppositional target of the activist political agitation. Generalized assaults on late capitalism, market ideology, or the trendy pejorative moniker neoliberalism are commonplace in this literature, as are blanket denigrations of prominent thinkers and liberal intellectual traditions. Milton Friedman, frequently deemed an architect or guru of disaster capitalism; Friedrich A. Hayek, also a chief architect of neoliberalism, public choice theory, and libertarianism in general, as irredeemably tainted by white supremacy, even in the absence of tangible evidence for this charge. Marxist ideology and its many schismatic derivatives from the critical theory world are often baked into this same literature, as are overt activist strategies, making the heavy normative baggage of this mode of analysis an unavoidable feature. In fact, a prominent subset of the compound intersectionality literature is even explicitly devoted to protecting the concept from the supposed corrupting incursions of neoliberal hierarchies and knowledge economies, which are depicted as existential threats to the activists' objectives as a supposed intersectional political project. In its ubiquitous academic deployment, compound intersectionality theory functions as an epistemic trump card wherein the vantage point of an identity group or groups is invoked in the place of weak evidence to establish a social scientific claim as true or to shut down and exclude a competing viewpoint with stronger evidence. We see this pattern frequently in arguments that seek to dismiss salient criticisms of a weakly attested normative proposition on account of presumptive observations about the critic's own race, gender, class, religion, or other identity category. While it may be tempting to dissociate these ideological manifestations from the core of intersectionality theory, simply returning to Crenshaw reveals a frank admission that an ideological project lay at the root of its elementary form. Recognizing that identity politics takes place at the site where categories intersect thus seems more fruitful than challenging the possibility of talking about categories at all, she explained in a 1990 expansion on the concept. Through an awareness of intersectionality, we can better acknowledge and ground the differences among us and negotiate the means by which these differences will find expression in constructing group politics. It offers no use to pivot back to the elementary form of the concept as a means of avoiding the substantial ideological baggage and far-left political activism of its compound iteration, as the two are inextricably linked in its original formulation. In noting this conundrum, one need not embrace the oversimplified formulations of its underlying critique that come from the editorializing of the political right. Such arguments are still heavy on political rhetoric and uncharitable to the intersectionality concept, even as they touch upon very real problems with its compound form. A more robust and intellectual criticism of the operative mechanisms may instead be found within scholarly criticisms of the broader critical theory framework. A handful of pertinent examples come to mind. Adam Martin's assessment of the new egalitarianism identifies two characteristics at play in much of this literature, and compound forms of intersectionality theory seem acutely susceptible. First, such contributions are often intentionally obscurantist, which is to say, they adopt an intellectual style to evade critical scrutiny of their claims. Harry Frankfurt applies the moniker bullshit to this type of argumentation, differentiating it from an outright deception by noting that the academic bullshitter is characterized by a disregard for truth in the service of a narrative or persuasive aim. With its already tenuous relationship to falsifiability in the elementary form, compound intersectionality seems particularly susceptible to sliding down the obscurantist slope of purposeful indulgences in cluttered exercises of proprietary jargon that attempt to imbue its baser political claims with an air of intellectual sophistication. The second feature of such literature, as Martin notes, is its epistocratic tendencies, achieved by self-invocation of the intersectionality literature as an arbiter of its own validity. Intersectionality's origins within a relatively narrow slice of literature on mid-century feminism may render it particularly vulnerable on this count, as seen in Crenshaw's discovery of what may, in its elementary form, be little more than a prosaic approximation of quantitative analysis, minus the social scientific validation of empirical testing. When shifted to its compound iteration, the process of self-validation becomes an achromatic exercise, which is to say that intersectionality theorists adopt a posture of preemptively excluding viewpoints that emerge exogenously to the intersectional literature, including older and competing conceptual frameworks for the study of race, gender, and compounding interactions involving social identity. The very act of contestation of an intersectional claim, including its built-in ideological implications, thus becomes discountable by casting it as an untrained misunderstanding of what intersectionality means. The combination of the two, obscurantism and epistocracy, thus functions to elevate a weak and ideologically loaded social scientific claim into a position of being politically unassailable. As a final consideration, the compound and politically loaded form of intersectionality theory carries with it the distinct risk of crowding out more conceptually robust attempts to provide substantive understanding of the problems of racial and other forms of discrimination, including their overlapping effects. Perhaps this subject will elicit further discussion in the responses, but two potential avenues warrant brief mention. The first is within the classical liberal line of anti-discriminatory theory, noted at the outset of my response essay, and perhaps more recently explored through the public choice literature on the operation of discriminatory non-market institutions. The second is to turn to the economic literature on race, and particularly the evolution of different barriers to economic and social life as experienced by persons facing discrimination. Such discussions, drawing upon a multitude of methods and intellectual traditions outside of the critical theory world, offer meaningful insights for combating the harms of both explicit and soft bigotries. Social scientific analysis of this subject suffers, though, if competing and exogenous attempts to grapple with the problem of discrimination are pushed aside by or subordinated to the pronounced ideological activism of the intersectionality literature. On intersectionality and classical liberalism, is there a common thread? Returning to the question of what room, if any, exists for commonality between intersectionality and classical liberalism, allow me to offer a few observations in light of the foregoing discussion. First, I agree with Levi that the elementary form of intersectionality is largely non-objectionable when presented in isolation. It has also been uncharitably depicted in conservative editorializing, at least when understood as the same isolated elementary form. My one caveat, and where I likely diverge from Levi on this point, is that the elementary version of intersectionality just isn't all that profound of an insight. It is perhaps a convenient neologism for a common intuitive observation. Insofar as classical liberal theory is concerned, its isolated form does not necessarily conflict. But our sympathies for the least well-off and our legitimate desires to grapple with the persistent problems of discrimination and bigotry in social interactions will be much better served by tapping the long and vibrant intellectual tradition of liberal toleration and its many anti-discriminatory extensions. Compound intersectionality presents a much trickier set of problems vis-à-vis the same liberal tradition due to its ideological baggage. Insofar as the compound form is an inexorable and consciously projected political activist iteration of its elementary framing, and as we've seen, Crenshaw treats it as such, it may be irreconcilable. Multiple prominent intersectional theorists expounding the compound form have made no effort to conceal their own hostility to classical liberal thought and thinkers, to free market economies, to capitalism, to neoliberalism, whatever that is other than a derisive term for the aforementioned concepts, and to libertarian perspectives as a whole. And even more so, much of this hostility takes form of invoking unfalsifiable esotericism to detect hidden strains of racism, sexism, white supremacy, and other contemptible bigotries in the DNA of that which the intersectionality literature derides for political reasons. In its most abusive manifestations, this serves little other purpose than to preemptively discredit any external scrutiny that might otherwise challenge the accompanying ideological propositions to the compound form by casting them outside of the realms of respectable dialogue. Whether classical liberal thought may still incorporate intersectionality theory, or at least its compound forms, may therefore depend on considerations beyond our control, as much of the intersectionality literature has already adopted an explicit rejection of the very same proposition. This concluding thought will likely be unwelcomed among those who see greater hope for constructively adapting intersectional analysis to liberal philosophy, but it needn't rest on my own pessimism towards the concept. Crenshaw herself has effectively rendered the same judgment in her most recent book. That book amounts to a broadside against the very notion of economic sciences. The emergence of economics as a discipline, she contends, suppressed the study of socially constructed institutions by reducing human behavior to the sum total of autonomous actions by universally interchangeable, rational, and self-interested acquisitive subjects. This caricature is rendered all the more astounding in her identification of what she sees as a primary culprit for this supposed trend, namely, the emergence of the public choice subfield. This mid-20th century outgrowth of the classical liberal economic theory might strike the independent observer as uniquely suited to the study of socially constructed institutions and the harmful incentive structures therein, including discriminatory collective action. Crenshaw, however, preemptively dismisses it, and she does so by adopting the above-mentioned patterns of obscurantist deflection and self-referential curation to exclude this line of analysis entirely. Drawing explicitly upon the conspiratorial historical falsifications of Nancy MacLean, Crenshaw contends, the public choice paradigm linked attacks on a broad range of public institutions, especially public education, with the preservation of American apartheid. She continues, declaring that the core logic of an entire academic subfield, public choice, is implicitly constituted around assumptions of white supremacy, even as it disavowed any racial intent and animus. If you still hold out hope that classical liberal thought can be constructively reconciled with intersectionality theory in a way that meets Crenshaw's own terms, I can only suggest that you are likely being as dismissive of underlying problems with intersectionality as the political right is with intersectionality itself. But that's the end of this. Thank you for listening. Like, share, and subscribe if you want more of this kind of content. As I said, this is more just a read. I just have a few thoughts. There's some of the things that I've discussed already in the conversation that I had with Stephen. I like seeing sometimes you see someone, okay, this might just a confirmation bias, but this whole idea where some of the things where I'm like, okay, as I mentioned at the start of this, and as I've mentioned in previous conversations, is some of the core ideas and the observations that are being made are things that I agree with. And I've seen that there's other ways that they're being done. There's certain objections and certain things that I'll come to that I'll think about some time back and then realize, oh, someone has written about this. Oh, there's an entire field studying this and using better tools to do this. And this is one of my ongoing questions in the conversation about critical theory that I've been having with Stephen is, we understand these are actual issues. There's actual issues. The feminism talks about actual issues. Fat theory talks about actual issues. Critical race theory talks about actual issues. Intersectionality talks about actual issues. Queer theory points out certain things that are not really discussed in actual issues. But the applications of it, what they're saying should be done to actually fix these things and change these things, are those accurate? Problems occur not because of what X is, but because of how we define X. So if you define X as being something that is caused by something else and being prevalent in a location where it's not, you'll be wasting your energy, or you will be utilizing different tools, building different ways to fix something that is not really appropriate to fix what is actually there, or you might be focusing on somewhere while it exists somewhere else and you're ignoring that actual part of it, or you're ignoring the fact that this was actually more prevalent in this area and was actually dealt with, so let's look at how they dealt with it there and let's see if we can transfer that to this place. So that's part of the problems that I see from not identifying something accurately, and then the things that you say we're going to do because of this definition of what this thing is. Those are the problems that can actually occur. So that's one of the things in there. I think there's also something they kept going like Levi. It's Levy. I think you say Levi. I don't know. I went through both of them. Like, you thinking like Eugene Levi. I had a friend, Jordan Levy. I had a friend in high school who had this actual spelling. I know there's like Levi jeans where it's like Levi. So I kind of kept going between the two of them. And I'm also thinking like, bye, bye, Miss American Pie. Drove my Chevy to the levee. And that's spelled in a different way. I don't know. So I'm just trying to think of like the levee thing. So excuse my whole like jumping back and forth with that one. Now, again, the last one I think I'll talk about is the unfair characterization by people on the political right. I have talked about how there's a lot of similarities between the the current day religions, secular religions of progressivism and things like critical race theory, as they are with the traditional religions. And one objection that I've seen, the only groups self-identified in the United States of America of big religious identification groups that skew more to the right, to the political right, are, I think it was the evangelical Christians, and who was the other group? The Mormons. Every other group, self-identified, more of them lean to the political left. More of them lean Democrat. So this whole idea that, oh, when they say the Christian right, okay, the Christian right is a specific subgroup within the right, and that is mostly the evangelicals and some of the Mormons, some of those people that are more activist towards it. Just like the activists, the progressive left, they're not indicative of the entire left. I think those would be the kind of two opposites: the critical race theorists versus the the Christian right, the people who are more tied into the actual belief systems. That's why when you go to this and you're talking about the thing where it's like, oh, they're willing to lie in favor of the actual dogma, in favor of the actual thing. Oh, intersectionality is right because intersectionality says it is. That is what happens with religious ways of approaching things. You're not lying because your actual truth, the actual truth is the intersectionality. You're not lying when you lie for God because the actual truth is God. What God says is true is what is true. So that is the ultimate truth that they're living by. So you see that kind of effect. That's why I think there might be something like one of these other one of the other videos that I had on my channel was one talking about how the Christian right does understand the actual effect of intersectionality, critical race theory, critical theory, and things like this getting into the schools, because they understand that when they take people, when they take kids and put them into Sunday schools, they understand you indoctrinate kids early, and then they grow up to believe as you tell them to. That's the same thing that's happening with intersectionality. That's why they have that focus saying, oh, especially public education. That is a key thing. That is the biggest resource. Humans are the most valuable resource that exists on Earth. And when you're thinking about the state, when you're thinking about control, when you're thinking about power, when you're thinking about influence, it is about that human resource. It's about controlling how the humans think in better ways. And this power, this control, this state, I am also going to finish off with saying this. I think most of them are doing it for positive reasons. They, for some reasons, think this is true. In the past, when people were teaching kids and teaching everyone about Zeus and Olympus, they weren't doing it because they're saying, oh, this is completely wrong, this is going to hurt people. They were trying to improve and trying to make observations about what they knew or what they observed about the world and trying to make the world a better place. This is the thing. You might agree with some of the things in intersectionality. You may agree with some of these things, but are they the best tools? So that's just what I wanted to think of this. What's also in here to finish off, it says here it's also from this issue, lead essay of groups, intersections, and people who inhabit them by Jacob T. Levy. So I think this was a response to that, and then response essays to this actual thing. This essay I just read, was by Phil Magness responding to this article by Levi, or Levy, again, with that one. And then the response essay was this: does critical liberalism need intersectionality theory by Phillip Magness? And then there's also another one, intersectionality, friend or foe of classical liberalism by Fabio Rojas. So I might read that in a separate one. And they say here, reply to Magness and Rojas by Jacob T. Levi. Levy. So there's another response here. So I think with those ones, I might go in and read them by myself, or I might actually come in and do another separate video where I actually read the responses. I'll let me know. First of all, just let me know in the comment section what you think about these ones where I actually just read the content. Because these are things I'm going to read anyway. I do them in my first read. I don't normally actually read them before I actually come out and actually record the video. And there is some editing where I'm like, okay, I just said this word in a completely wrong way. It was talking about the obscurantism, or some of the things we're talking about, certain words that are difficult. Here, some of the words and things like this are things that I've said before, like ubiquitous. That's something that I think of. I understand the meaning of that word. And if I actually looked at the generally agreed definition of that word and saw how it was being used here, I think it would fit. I think the difference is with some of the people on intersectionality and some of these things, they seem to use certain language that is almost slang, that is almost exact to them. It says, to them, this word means something else. We say abolish the police, but abolish the police really means reimagine, reinvest, and do all these things. Then why don't you say that instead of saying abolish? Because, for example, no one's going to... Imagine if the abolitionists back in the times of slaves were like, we just want to reimagine your slavery. We want to reimagine your bondage and then kind of reinvest where it goes. No, it's abolishing. If you're talking about abolishing, you're talking about just ending something. You're ending the institution completely. So some of these things, the words, you say, what does that word mean? It's not my job to educate you. if you need to ask that question, then this is not about you. It's like, no. Please, let's have a situation where we can have a conversation. Even if you're using very specific words. I like getting into semantics. Sometimes I get all pedantic with these things. If you're using these specific words, if you're using language that is a little more difficult, these heavy words, as long as those words still mean what they mean when I actually go down and look at them in a dictionary or ask you and they actually mean a certain thing, that's one thing to kind of understand. So I think that's it. Let me know what you think about these readings. I'm going to do more of these. You can check my channel out. Again, like, share, and subscribe. On the screen, I think I would have gone with the speed drawing of the Anti-Socialist Distancing Club design. There's also merchandise you can buy with that. This is a play on that design of the anti-social social club thing. It's like a street art type of thing. And this thing I used to have in the past where I used to think I was the most social, antisocial person. Like you go into like online where it's like I'm not really that social in person, but then I have all these friends online and you talk to all these people. So this is the kind of thing, but I think the anti-social social club, that's kind of a cool thing. It's like I'm anti-social, but hey, we're social, we're gonna hang out together and things like that. I don't know. So there is that one, but this one's like playing both on the pandemic situation, anti-social distancing with that, but anti-socialist distancing, going like, I am anti-socialist. I don't really agree with much of the socialists, and then anti-socialist distancing club. So we are not anti-socialist distancing. We are actually we're anti-socialist, and then we're a distancing club. We're going to be like a club of people who identify socialists, and we're anti that socialist stuff, and we distance ourselves from that. We're distancing ourselves from socialism because we're anti-socialism. So that's the kind of idea with this kind of design. Let me know what you think. More merchandise. I'm going to be trying to do more like videos or designs matching or art stuff matching with the actual things. I think art is a language of life, and there's also these kind of things with that, and things, trying to get understanding. Like, share, subscribe. Till next time, appreciate your time. Goodbye.